very much for the kind introduction. It's certainly an honor and a pleasure to be here to deliver this lecture. And it certainly wouldn't have happened without a special invitation from my colleague, Professor Paulina Mock, and also Professor Martin McGinley from my university and the Science Unit. It's been a real pleasure to be here and to be able to take up this offer. Since I've arrived in Hong Kong, we've had some marvelous conversations. I've had some wonderful food. We've done some wonderful trips out to look at all sorts of things that are of mutual interest to us from a research point of view. I also had the special privilege of being able to visit MyPo with Professor Jonathan Fong. We collected water samples on that particular field trip. So I've seen a lot in the 10 days that I've been here. I've certainly enjoyed lots of parks, which is one of our common areas of interest. So we visited Victoria Park in Causeway Bay and lots of the smaller parks around the city. And so we've got interest in air pollution and noise and how people can escape noise in parks and have downtime. I've also really enjoyed seeing how people move around the city because transport is clearly one of my main areas of interest. And I'm always amazed when I come to Hong Kong. I think the first time I came here and I saw high-rise, you keep looking up and up and up. It's amazing. And the really high density means that there's lots of opportunities to provide very efficient transport systems to people. There's lots of people to get around, but you've got the density, so you can have really good train systems, really good bus systems. So I've been on the trains, I've been on the bus, I've been in taxi, I've been in my car, I've done a fair bit of walking, so I sort of experienced the commuter environment within Hong Kong. New Zealand is very, very different from Hong Kong. We've got a very low population density. So back in the 1950s and 60s, particularly, when the population was relatively low, if there was new people that came in, well, you just built another house. All the houses are single-story and have a big backyard because there's lots of expansive fields. So you just keep building further and further and further, and you just extend the motorway just a little bit further. And so New Zealand is one of the countries in the world now that has the highest vehicle ownership, private cars. Everybody's got a car, and some families have 2 cars per person. So very high vehicle ownership. And we love our cars, so everybody drives everywhere by car. And you sort of need to because we're all so spread out. But in the last 20 years or so, the population has increased, and the inner part of the city has become more dense. So where we had single-story housing and a big garden, now we have houses. They're building a second house on that same lot. And there's places where they're now building up. So instead of single-story, we now have 2 stories and 3 stories. And so as the population becomes more dense, then you can imagine the roads, the motorways, will start to get clogged up, right? And so cars are no longer really very viable. We have huge traffic delay problems, and we're looking at other solutions. So we're kind of in a different space to Hong Kong in terms of where we're at with our transport. There's a lot of work that's been done in the last 20 years looking at public transport, so our train network has improved. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've finally gone to electric trains instead of diesel. So it wasn't that long ago, we actually had an indoor station in the center of Auckland where we had diesel trains coming into it, diesel commuter trains, which is kind of crazy. And we had these big extractor fans on the roof to try and remove all the particles. So now we're completely electric, which is a huge improvement. So as well as public transport, there's been a big push in Auckland to try and get more people to ride bicycles. It's nice weather most of the year, it doesn't get too hot, it doesn't get too cold, sometimes it's a bit wet. But trying to get people to ride bicycles instead of taking their cars is one big step. And quite a lot of infrastructure has been put in place to try and encourage that. One of the other things they've been pushing quite strongly is also to try and get more children to walk to school. So the busiest times in terms of traffic is dropping children off at school at 8:30 and 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, because all the kids traditionally get just driven to school. So everywhere within a kilometre of a school gets completely congested, and it seems a little bit ridiculous. So they're trying to encourage more and more children to walk instead of being driven. So with more people walking and more people cycling, this has implications in terms of air pollution exposure, because your road transport corridor, or that area immediately surrounding a road, is one of the places where your air pollution levels can be the highest. And so if you're walking and you're cycling, you're being exposed to air pollution that you might not be to the same extent if you're driving in a car or in a bus and you're enclosed and sort of separated from the exhaust to some extent. So this is where this interest in exposure to pedestrians and cyclists comes from. So what I'm going to be talking about today is looking at air pollution exposure for active mode commuters. And by active mode commuters, I mean people that cycle and walk, and the inputs of urban transport infrastructure on that exposure. Okay, so that's kind of what this talk is going to be about. I'm not sure this is working for me. Is it? Or I'm just not close enough. That might be better. Okay, so this is the outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about sustainable transport and what we mean by that, as well as active modes. I'm then going to talk a little bit about sources of air pollution, so beyond transport, what are the other main sources? I think it's important also to talk about why we care about air pollution from the point of view of health, how we go about measuring air pollution, the importance of dose rather than exposure in health studies, two different ways of looking at how it impacts on people, the role of separation in air pollution dose for active mode commuters. So this is about how far away a person is from the road source and what the implications are of that. I'll then talk a little bit about route choice. So when you're going from A to B, from home to, so when you came from wherever you were at home this morning and came into university, you had different choices about which route to take, and there were implications of that in terms of your exposure. And then I'll finish up by talking about some new technologies in terms of transport and what some of the issues are associated with that. So that's the plan. Okay, so let's start by talking about sustainable transport and active modes. Okay, so I've just got some pictures up here of different modes of transport. Some of these are more sustainable than others. The car is obviously the one that we're going to be focusing on in terms of producing the pollution. So a car can be considered relatively low in terms of sustainability. So often a car might be taking one person, at most it might be taking 3 or 4 people. So it's quite a big vehicle to move around for a small number of people in terms of the pollution that it produces. A bus, on the other hand, it's still a vehicle. A bus might produce maybe 5 times as much pollution as one car, but you might get 40 people in the bus. So it's more efficient in terms of the emissions per person, per kilometer who's transported by that particular vehicle, so better in a lot of ways. And then of course, when you look at trains, especially if they're electric, and the energy that's produced in order to run the train, or the electricity that's provided in order to run the train, if that's produced in a sustainable way, then that's an improvement as well. And then of course there's walking, and some of you may be fortunate enough to live close enough to university that you can just walk here, and that's your main mode of commuting. But certainly if you're taking the train or the bus, it's likely that walking forms part of your complete journey. So you might be walking to the bus station, catching the bus, and then the bus doesn't drop you off exactly where you need to be, and there's a walk at the end, so there's a walk, bus, walk. So for most people, walking forms part of their journey. And of course, not so popular here, there's also cycling, but cycling is very popular in other countries. I did see a few people cycling in Hong Kong on the motorways, or the really busy roads, and I thought, oh, there wasn't a lot of space for them. They seem pretty keen, and they look like racing cyclists. So I'm not sure I would quite be up to that, but so there's a little bit of cycling. It's quite popular in New Zealand as a recreational activity, as well as for transport. Okay, so some of these modes more sustainable than others, and the 2 active modes would be the walking and the cycling. And active because you need to breathe harder than you would be if you're just sitting down in order to get yourself from A to B. And that, of course, becomes important because if you're breathing harder, then you're actually breathing in more air that could be polluted compared to if you were sedentary. Okay, so let's move on now to talk about some of the main sources of air pollution. So cars obviously is what's going to be the focus for today. But here are some other main sources of air pollution, and in particular industry. And this is quite important, I guess, for Hong Kong, particularly with China nearby. Large amounts of pollution is produced, and it can be transported quite long distances and affect people significantly, reasonably far away from the source. Another source of air pollution that's quite significant in many places around the world, but also in New Zealand, is home heating using wood. So there's lots of small towns in New Zealand where the population is not very high, there's not very many cars because there's not very many people, so cars aren't really a problem. But a lot of people burn wood, and often the wood can be collected for free, and they use that to heat homes. And then you can have days where it's very, it's not very windy, and so the smoke accumulates and affects the populations that live in those small towns. So you don't need very many for it to have an impact on people. I've also got there home cooking indoors, so particularly in developing countries where there's lots of cooking that happens using wood in an indoor environment and there's not a lot of ventilation, then that can impact on people's exposure as well. And finally, smoking. So this is a big thing around the world. A lot of work was done, I guess, in the 60s and 70s around the health impacts of smoking. And more recently, there's been a lot more focus on not only the impact of the person smoking the cigarettes, but the people that live in the same household as the person smoking the cigarettes and what impact that might have on them. So you might have a parent who's smoking, how does that affect the children that live in the same house? So those are some of the big ones that are impacting on people around the world to a greater or lesser extent, depending on which country or which region we're talking about. Okay, so why do we care about air pollution in terms of health? Okay, so here we go. So air pollution. Yeah. So air pollution is made up of basically two essential general categories of air pollution. One is gases, and the other one is particulate matter. So by gases, we're talking about carbon monoxide. Is a common pollutant from petrol engines. There's things like oxides of nitrogen. There's actually sulfur dioxide on there that I've missed, but also ozone. So there's a number of different pollutants that are purely sort of chemical species that impact on people. And then there's particulate matter that can be measured in different sizes. So this is little particles in the air, okay? Little ones, bigger ones, and bigger ones. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The reason we worry about air pollution is because it has an impact on people's lung function. That's the main thing. So it impacts on people's ability to breathe. It's particularly problematic for people that have existing conditions. So people that are asthmatic, the air pollution can trigger asthma or can trigger various sort of breathing issues. It also impacts on people's ability to resist infection. Okay, so if you're more like, so infection is an issue as well. And also a reduced ability to deliver oxygen to your body, and that's particularly relevant for carbon monoxide. So instead of passing oxygen to your body, hemoglobin picks up the carbon monoxide, and your body doesn't want the carbon monoxide, doesn't do anything, so it prevents oxygen being released to the tissues. So CO is important as well. Air pollution exposure is also linked to cancer. So in terms of lung function, it's really about what happens immediately. So you get a bit of an exposure and then it affects you pretty much straight away. Whereas from the point of view of cancer, you're talking about the cumulative lifetime dose of a person. So it's not just what you've just breathed and whether you manage to get here without having any problems breathing, but it's also what's happening to you as you get older in life. So that's important as well. People that are most exposed or most affected by air pollution are the young. So young children who have lungs that are underdeveloped tend to be most prone. Also the elderly and people that have existing respiratory conditions. So those are the most prone. In terms of particles, it's really the tiny particles that are of most concern in terms of human health. So particles can be measured, the standard ones that tend to be measured is PM10, PM2.5, and PM1. And you might have seen these reported in the news and wondered perhaps what they mean. But the 10, PM stands for particulate matter, and the 10 stands for 10 microns in diameter. So essentially it means any particles that if you squash them into a round shape, they would have an equivalent diameter of 10 microns. That sounds quite small, but from an air pollution point of view, it's actually quite at the large end. And in fact, anything that, so you have to look at the diagram here, I haven't got a pointer, but the very large particles aren't so much of a worry because your upper respiratory tract is very well able to trap them. So your upper lungs are full of mucus, And the mucus is actually quite good because it means that when you breathe in polluted air, all of those big particles get picked up by that mucus, and then you can spit it out or you swallow it, and your body's able to rid of it. The smaller the particle, the more deeply they can penetrate into the lungs. So anything less than 10 microns in diameter can make it down to the zone in your lungs where respiration occurs. And so PM2.5, PM1 are even tinier. And now the interest is mainly from an air pollution point of view in particles that are called ultrafine particles, which are 0.1 microns in diameter. So they're the really, really tiny ones that make it right down into the alveoli. People worry most about those. They're also the hardest to measure in a way. Yeah, I won't get into all of that. Black carbon is another measure they use for the very tiny particles. So the important message is the smaller, the more important it is from a health point of view. Okay, so how do we go about actually measuring air pollution? Okay, so I managed to spot one of these when I was out on one of our field trips. It's very exciting. This is one of the fixed monitors in Hong Kong. There's actually, I'm told there's 3 of these that are roadside. So these monitors tend to be placed at various different locations to be characteristic of the environment in which they're placed. So often, the ones that are of interest to me are the ones that are located next to busy roads, right? So there's 3 of these in Hong Kong. They tend to be they're pretty expensive, as you can imagine. They often need air conditioning and humidity control, and that's the temperature control. So they're quite expensive to operate, but they give you very accurate information about the air pollution levels at a particular location. So most cities have some of these. So Hong Kong has at least a few roadside ones. Auckland's got some as well. And it's very good for tracking what's going on in the air pollution, in terms of air pollution over time. So what they use for the regulation. So what you can do is to see trends. So if there's decreases over time, you'll be able to pick it up at this one site because it's fixed in one spot and it's monitoring continuously. And often, I'm not sure which pollutants are in there, but often multiple pollutants at the same time. Okay, so it gives you a really good impression of what's happening in terms of the air quality at that location. But clearly, in Hong Kong, so you've got 3 of these to represent the entire Hong Kong area, right? And interesting, if I went from that side and crossed over to the other side of the road, it may well be that the air pollution levels might be 10 times as high just from crossing the street, okay, or 1/10 as high. Okay, so one of the challenges with air pollution is that it's very, very spatially variable. So even just one side of the road to the other, a factor of 10, right? So these monitors are very good for tracking what's happening over time, but don't tell you a lot about what's happening spatially over the city. Okay, so we need other strategies for looking at how it varies over space. And one of the types of monitors that gets used quite often to get an idea of the spatial variability of the pollutants are these ones up in the top left that are called diffusion tubes. And these are kind of the opposite in a way. They're very inexpensive. So those little tubes might cost probably 20 or 30 Hong Kong dollars to analyze. But essentially, it's a little tube, it's got a little bit of gauze inside. You set it out in the field, you take the cap off, and then it absorbs onto the little surface inside air pollution, and you leave it out for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And after 2 or 3 weeks, you put the cap back on, bring it back to the lab, and you do chemical analysis on it, and you get given a concentration. So what it tells you is what the concentration was on average over a 3-week period. Okay, so the time resolution is not very good, but because they're so inexpensive, you can run campaigns where you might put 100 of these out or 200 at relatively low cost. So it gives you a good idea about how the pollution varies over space, information that the fixed monitor doesn't give you. Okay, so it's just something a little bit different. And then you probably want to look at how it changes by season. So you might want to do a winter campaign and a summer campaign, but very useful for giving you that oversight of the spatial variability. And it's also quite often used for identifying where those fixed air pollution monitors ought to go, or where more monitoring is needed. So trouble spots, where the air pollution levels are high, it's often used for that. So we've done quite a lot of campaigns in Auckland where we put diffusion tubes out and sort of tracked pollution over space, and it is really quite interesting. Now, The other way of looking at air pollution, which is my favorite, is to do portable monitoring. So these little gadgets, so the ones down the bottom on the left, called P-traps, they look like a little portable vacuum cleaner. Dust busters, I don't know whether you have dust busters in Hong Kong, but look like a little dust buster machine. And so these those ones, the three on the shelf there, they will measure ultrafine particle counts. The one on the right here is at the bottom is a carbon monoxide monitor. Okay, that's also a portable monitor that you can put in a little pouch on your body and walk around with it. Okay, so the P-track you carry and the CO monitor you put in your pouch. But the advantage of these monitors is it gives you a really good idea of what people get exposed to when they're going about their normal daily activities. So for example, with the Langings especially, the little blue flat, well actually they're both blue, the flat box, the CO monitor, we've done studies where we've handed them out to students and they've hang on to them for a week and it measures continuously at about 1 second resolution or 1 minute or whatever you set it to. And they've kept diaries of their activities. So whether they're in their house, they might be walking to university, they might be sitting in a classroom, they might be having lunch at the place where they're cooking, right? And then they might go back to the classroom, they might go to the gym, and they might sort of walk home. And what you can do is to then look at the different activities that people are involved in, right? And start looking at where people are accumulating their air pollution based on the activity data. Okay, so that's quite common. And from those sorts of studies, it's been identified that there's actually two areas that are really important. One is the home environment, and that's at least in part, mainly because people spend so much time at home. So it's really important in terms of your total lifetime cumulative exposure, how much time you spend at home as well. You know, what the levels are in your home is really important. But also the transport microenvironment, because that's where the air pollution levels tend to be quite high, certainly in New Zealand environment. So we focused on transport. So we've done lots of studies with people walking around, going on different modes, walking different sides of the street, walking through parks, and doing comparisons. And it's actually quite nice as a project when you have two students that have to work in a pair, because you can do comparisons of different sides of the streets in parallel. Okay, so lots of endless interesting studies that you can do comparing air pollution exposure using these devices. Okay, what next? Okay, so what we need to take home from that is that air pollution concentrations are highly variable in time and space. So fixed monitoring is not necessarily a good measure of individual exposure. It tells us about long-term trends, but not so good for individuals. Mobile monitoring allows an individual's exposure to be tracked over a period of time so the exposures can be compared with their location and activity. Okay, so those are the sorts of studies that I'm going to be talking about from now on in terms of air pollution. Okay, so let's have a look now at the importance of dose rather than exposure in health studies. I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but let's look at it properly. I'm going to put up my only equation. So if you don't like equation, you can ignore the bottom one, okay, because the information is in the one above. Actually, they're all equations, but some of them are nicer looking than other ones. So exposure versus dose. So when we talk about exposure, what we mean is the concentration that is in the air. Okay, so there might be a certain level of air pollution that we're all experiencing in this room, and that's your exposure. Your dose tells you how much you breathed while doing a particular activity. Okay, so let's say one of you walked from your apartment that might be half an hour away, and you walked here to come to the talk this evening. Okay, there would be an average concentration of air pollution that you got exposed to on your half an hour walk to here. That would be your exposure, right? So, but your dose would be your concentration times your travel time. So concentration times 30 minutes, right? The other thing that's important in terms of your dose is your breathing rate. So if you traveled here by car, concentration times travel time, your breathing rate would be at a resting breathing rate. So it would be just your normal, everyday, relaxed breathing rate. Whereas if you walked here for half an hour, your breathing rate might be 3 or 4 times what it was if you were sitting in your car. So for the same concentration and the same travel time, you would have breathed 3 or 4 times as much pollution because of the fact that you breathe 3 or 4 times as much air. Does that all make sense? Yeah? Okay, so your dose takes into account your concentration, your travel time, but also your breathing rate. Okay, this is going to be important for what I'm going to talk about later. And you can see why for active modes this becomes important, because you're always increasing your activity level over a resting rate when you're walking or you're running or you're cycling. Okay, so here's a fun study we did quite a few years ago now, 2015. So we had, there was a company that had had 7 volunteers who were super keen to take part in the study. They wanted to look at, or help us look at, air pollution dose for different modes of commuting. So we had 7 people, and they all chose a different mode, each a different mode. We had, you won't know this, probably most of you won't know this, some of you will know, Green Lane is a fairly busy sort of roundabout. This was the starting point. And Newmarket, where the star is at the end, was the finishing point. So basically they all started in the same location, all ended up in the same location, but they traveled there by a different mode. So we had one person taking the bus, we had one person taking a sort of a scooter or a mini motorcycle, we had one person on a bicycle, we had one person running, we had one person walking, we had one person going by train, and one person going by car. And each of them carried one of those little portable monitors with them. And each of them chose whichever route they thought was most appropriate for their mode, right? So we let people decide. So the walkers would probably choose the most direct route. The train person obviously had to walk to the train station, catch the train, get off the train, walk to work, not much choice there. The car driver could go on the motorway or could choose to go along the main road, and so on. So everybody had a slightly different path to get from A to B depending on what was appropriate for their mode. And we did that it was a 5-kilometer journey, popular commuting route. We did it once in the summer and once in the winter. So this isn't meant to be definitive, it's more a bit of fun. We only did 1 day of each, but I'll show you what the results were that we got. Okay, so these 2 graphs here are called time series. So it's a concentration on the y-axis and time along the x-axis. And each of those different lines, it's not actually very easy to see on this one, I'll show you some results a little bit later, but each of those different lines represents the concentrations for each of the different modes. And what you can see from here, actually the most obvious thing is that walking takes an awfully long time, so the person who walked got there last. Okay, so think about dose being concentration times travel time times breathing rate, right? It takes a long time to get there. Poor walker, it took forever. Actually, interestingly enough, this one here is actually the train. So the second slowest in Auckland was actually the train. And this was actually before we sorted out our train system. So now trains come every 10 minutes, which is amazing for us. But in those days, the trains were pretty unreliable. So this person both times was pretty unlucky. He must have just missed a train, but ended up having to wait quite a bit of time. So train was slow. Other modes were much quicker. Some of the highest concentrations, this in the black, yeah, it's a scooter, isn't it? I think it's a scooter. Some of the highest concentrations were on the scooter. And remember when you drive this little motorcycle, when you're driving a motorcycle, you're driving in the middle of the road and you haven't got any protection. So you're much more susceptible to peaks in concentration than you are if you're riding in a bus or riding in a car. Okay, interestingly enough, the concentrations were higher in summer than winter, which is actually unusual for Auckland. So it must have been perhaps the winter day was a bit more windy than the summer day. So this is where, if you want to do a rigorous study, you should be doing multiple days for comparison. Okay, but this is what we found. So in terms of average concentration, so this is there's no dose yet, just concentration. The person who was worst off was the person who rode the scooter, the little motorcycle, then the car, then the bike, then the bus, then walking, then running, then train. Okay, in terms of concentrations. So the scooter and the car are the ones that go down the middle of the road. The bike is off to the side. The bus tends to be on the side lane. Walking, you're on the footpath. Running, you're on the footpath. And train, you're kind of well away from the road. Okay, so this is going to come up later in terms of distance away from the main line of traffic. But certainly, yeah, that's the way it was. So average concentration. Now, have a look at what happens when we look at dose. right? So this is where I've multiplied it by the travel time, and I've multiplied it by just estimated breathing rates. This is what we get. And all of a sudden, we see that walking, biking, and running, which are all of the active modes that we want to be encouraging people to do, the dose is actually much higher than it is for the other modes. And in fact, bus and train are better than the active modes, but actually the best ones is actually to take your car. Which is completely not the answer we want. We want to be encouraging people to be walking and cycling. So obviously we've got a bit of a problem, but that's science, right? That's how it's worked out. Scooter and the car are the best way to go. And mainly because the Auckland environment is completely geared towards cars and scooters and not towards these other modes. So the public transport system is not sorted out properly. The bike, anyway, walking is slow regardless. Okay, where am I up to? I'm slightly lost. That one, oh yeah. Okay, we did another study that's similar to that one, where this time we looked at 5 modes: bicycle, bus, car, runner, and train rider. And we looked at carbon monoxide concentrations for those 5 different modes. This is actually from my campus, which is out in the suburbs into the city, so that's also a fairly popular commuting route. And we found that the bicycle was sort of similar to a car, the runner was a bit lower, bus was comparable to the runner, and the train was lower. Okay. But then when we looked at dose, multiplied by travel time, multiplied by breathing, all of a sudden, bicycle and running sort of pops out again. So similar sorts of conclusions that we got from the previous study. Okay, so what this tells us is that it's important to look at dose as well as exposure when considering the health effects of air pollution when people are traveling, either sort of walking, running, or exercising. Okay, so dose is important, travel time, and breathing rates.